maybe take a moment and readdress or answer any questions that you have now that you've had some time to think about it. So you'll remember last week we made, waiting for this to kick in, there we go, we made this chart. I didn't pause long enough to let you kind of write down the dates associated with each of these. You'll find this in your booklet, kind of the third page in, I believe. You'll see the same chart there. As a reminder, what we're seeing here is an outline of Daniel going from chapter 1 here on the left, chapter 2 through 4, and then 5 through 7, working our way back up, and then over to chapter 8 through the end of the book. We have the note here that the first chapter and the last 5 chapters are in Hebrew, but Aramaic through the middle of the message. And then, as I said, you can, if it's helpful for you, you can write the dates of each chapter so that as we're going through our study, you'll have the quick reference. That can be helpful. Any questions about this chart? We'll go through to the next page here, staying on the chart and kind of working back through why we laid it out this way. But any questions to begin with about this chart or any information that you see up there? I want to make sure we have time to talk it out. Okay. I see writing, so I'll give just a moment longer because I'll get rid of these dates here in a second. Okay. So, if you'll recall last week, we went ahead and started looking at the importance of laying it out this way. Because what we see when we kind of structure it differently than just reading through the book is this paralleling of certain sections of the book, that chapters 2 through 7 are reflective of each other. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream about 4 kingdoms that will be destroyed, and there will be a kingdom that lasts forever. Daniel has a dream about 4 kingdoms, this time in the form of a beast, not a statue as Nebuchadnezzar had, but as 4 beasts, and they too will be destroyed, and a kingdom will come that will last forever. And then you see in chapters 3 and 6 that God's people are tested in an earthly kingdom, right? So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into a fiery furnace as a result of their testing, and they survive. And Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, and he survives, showing something unique about relying on God in those trials. And then, of course, chapters 4 and 5, we see earthly kings tested. They're both warned. They're both given an option to turn from their evil ways. And at first, Nebuchadnezzar does not. And neither does Belshazzar. Belshazzar is struck dead immediately. Nebuchadnezzar falls from grace, falls from his reign as king. But then we noted the transitional part of this conversation is Nebuchadnezzar's humility and submission to God, ultimately resulting in a restoration of a kingdom. And so what we see here, even just on first look, is this structure where from chapter 2 to chapter 7, things are paralleling all along with this central idea here being Nebuchadnezzar's humility before God, getting restoration of his kingdom. This is a chiastic structure. So the first story matches the last, the second matches the next to the last, the third matches the next in line, all the way to the middle story within that narrative. So a really interesting insight into the structure of Daniel and starts to unveil part of that grander message of Daniel. Okay? Questions about this, or as you were studying this and thinking about it, Any observations you made looking at the chart? Okay. The literary device is called a chiastic structure. So that is C-H-I-A-T-I-C. Chiastic. I-A-S-T-I-C. Thank you. I forgot the S in there. Yeah. Which literally means crisscross. So you're seeing a crisscrossing of the storyline at this central point, right? We use something similar in English. We say that the story comes to the climax. It reaches that point where everything seems to take a different trajectory. In our stories, in our narratives, the climactic moment does not always result in an undoing or an exact paralleling of everything that led up to it. It can just send you off on a whole new direction. And so, but in a chiastic structure, it will literally parallel or reverse everything that had led up to that point. Okay? Something else that should hopefully stand out, or maybe this will draw your eye to see something unique here. We'll get rid of that. Is this line of the message on this chart. That from the beginning, we have God's people being provided for, chapter 1, in the midst of exile. And that if they continue to rely on God, He will help them survive through everything. Right? So chapter 1, we have the testing of Daniel, and we'll get into that this morning. Chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Chapter 6, again, Daniel. And then finally, chapter 9, kind of the central point of the latter portion of the book, is Daniel showing again a reliance on God and a desire to see things from God's perspective. How long, God? You said it would be 70 years. How much longer before we get to see the end of this? And so this narrative of chapters 1, 3, 6, and 9 kind of play a central core to all of the movement of the book. And that it helps us to see God working through His people and seeing them endure trials because of what God has done for them. Okay? Any other observations from this chart? We'll probably reference this more as we're going through the book, or you might be able to reference it some and add notes that you find interesting that link up to this description or this layout. I have enjoyed referencing back to this. I think for me it just unlocks a lot of the book. Helps to really see where we're going and how this all ties together. That the story of Daniel in the lion's den is not a standalone story, right? It can. It has its own value. But seeing these stories and these accounts work together brings a whole new insight and message to the book. Okay? I did mention, though, this is not the only chiastic structure through the book of Daniel. In fact, a large number of the book chapters, the stories that we'll read, have a very chiastic structure. They kind of hit this central point, and you see the reworking of everything. I'm going to show this briefly, not for you to copy, because what I want us to do is, as we read through and study through a chapter, before we move on to the next, challenge ourselves to see, is there a structure or is there a line of thinking in the chapter that helps to really point to a message within it, maybe deeper than what we had seen before? So just as a quick example, here's chapter 1. There is a chiastic structure to it which revolves around Daniel in a 10-day test that he suggests. Okay, that's all you get to see. I'm not giving you the cheat code all the way, all right? That's going to be for us to challenge and see. And we feel that when we read through chapter 10. Everything changes when it's agreed that we can do this 10-day fast. And we see God working in his people, right? Okay. Let's get into the text. Let's get into Daniel chapter 1. This is where it gets fun. We get to really look at the text and make observations for ourselves and really hopefully ask some questions. Hopefully collectively we can find the answers. Hopefully I've thought through most of your questions and can kind of help guide that, but surely you'll ask something I don't know and we'll figure it out together. So, Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them their names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. All right. Take a moment. Make some observations. Write down your questions. And then we'll talk about it. I'll give you about, it won't be very long, but about a minute and a half. And then we'll talk. All right. What do you notice? What questions might you have? Right over here, Xander. We'll have, names are going to be tough this morning. Sorry.
Two things. In verse 2, and the Lord gave, that to me meant the Lord's hand is in all of this.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, they're stripping these guys of their identity to remake them into what they want, which is what happens in a cult, right?
Right.
First thing they want to do is give you a new name. But Daniel and his friends don't lose their identity because their identity's in the Lord.
Good. All right. So 2 wonderful observations. The first of which the Lord gave. them into the hand of the enemy. God's hand is in this whole story. And even as these people are being sent into a trial and exile and captivity, God is still active. Right? I mean, that's a wonderful reminder to us that in our trials, God is still active. And then, the identity shift that is being made to them is being forced on them in some ways, is just a facade of change, right? Because as we see through the book, and even in chapter 1, they don't change. They don't change their trust in the Lord. Even though they've been sent into captivity, even though they're being chosen to become assimilated to a culture and given a new identity, they don't change. Because their identity is in God. Good. Appreciate that. Okay, what else do you see? Or maybe this, thinking about their shift of identity. Have you ever looked up what their names mean? K, I love it. Always in for the research. All right.
I can't read it, though.
Oh, you can't read it, so I'll read it for you, because you wrote it in my notes, too. I'll give you credit. So here we have a really interesting insight that Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, their names mean something. They're part of their identity in a way, right? Daniel would mean God is my judge. God is my judge. His family named him that to remind him daily and to remind anyone who would speak his name, God is my judge. It was part of who these people were. Hananiah, did anyone look that name up? I'm sorry? Yeah, Jah is favored, or God favors his people. It can also mean God is gracious. So in some way, it's talking of the favor or the grace that God gives to his people, Hananiah. Mishael, who is like God? Who is like him? Which of us could ever measure up to his fullness? Who is like him? Even the king that's forcing us to come into captivity, who is like God? Not even the king. Right? It's a reminder for them. Azariah, the Lord is my helper. God has helped. The Lord is my helper. Now, all of these names mentioned God, or the Lord, or Jah, as they might refer to him at times. When we see the shift, we not only see a change in what's being discussed, but who they are submitting to. This forcing of the culture, this identity shift, is them even trying to remove God from their mind and give them something else to look towards. And so Daniel, who was God is my judge, becomes Belteshazzar, which means Baal, protect the king, Baal, or favored by Baal. Okay, either one of those. That the idea of Belteshazzar would be, let our God, Baal, favor or shelter or protect the king. Right? So it's supposed to draw them to think of Nebuchadnezzar, the king. Let the God of Nebuchadnezzar protect him. Okay? And then Hananiah, who was God is gracious, or God has favored, becomes Shadrach. Anyone look that one up? What you got? One more time. Yes, so command of Aku, or commanded by Aku. Aku was the moon god. Also would be referred to as Marduk sometimes. So we have We have a reference to another god, a Babylonian god, and saying, I'm now under the command of that god. Mishael, who was a reminder of who is like God, becomes Meshach, the guest of Venus, who is like Aku. Yeah. So we see, and Azariah becomes Abednego, which becomes servant of, of the Shining One, or Ishtar, or Nego, or some other names. So the servant of Ishtar, or the Shining One. And so they're literally trying to strip their identity in how they think of themselves in relation to God and make them subservient or servant to the gods of their country and speak of their gods. Really interesting to see how they just on every level try to force them to become part of the culture. Okay? Any observations in that, or you can go into the rest of this first section and see what else you see in verses 1 through 7. Go ahead, Steve. Let's get the microphone over this time. Now we're getting to longer comments.
To go along with assimilating into the culture, they thought it was ideal and valuable to do that to the most gifted young youth for the future.
Yeah, part of selecting from the royal family and of nobility, and we can talk about some of the language he uses there, but this idea that a king would be conquering another nation and would be trying to grow their kingdom and strengthen their kingdom, well, it would make sense that what you would do is take some of the more affluent, the more knowledgeable, the more strong-minded and capable of taking your culture and helping to spread that out. You would take those who have the best ability to understand and reason and become part of your culture and now become part of the face or the name of your kingdom. And so, yeah, he's looking for the cream of the crop, isn't he? He's looking for the best. What else do you notice then? Oh, yeah. Let's get the microphone over this time.
I saw a parallel between us as Christians, because when we come out of the world, we have to lose our identity.
Yes.
We have to become new creatures. And you can lose your culture, your people, and your name, who you thought you were. That's it.
But in that instance, which is actually a good thing, the identity we're taking on is so much more valuable. It is so much greater than whatever we're leaving behind. Sure.
You're losing your old life, but you're gaining so much more, a better life.
Absolutely. They are now in what we might feel, though, because there's still the other struggle once you take on the identity of Christ, is are you going to fall back into the world? And so now Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah stand as examples of once we've taken on the identity of Christ, call ourselves Christians, and then are we going to maintain that? Or will we give in to the pressures of the modern day culture that we're in and begin to assimilate back to that way of thinking? Go ahead. Sorry. Names. Why are they not happening this morning?
Just a couple. This is something really quick, because we're going to get to this, I think, in verse 8, but and this goes along with what we're talking about. Isaiah has talked about this is going to happen. So did Jeremiah. He says, this is going to happen to you guys.
Yeah.
And he talks a lot about it, specifics. And what we see here, I think, for me, when I look at this, this is exactly what we're talking about. That Isaiah talks about God, you know, when God is going to make people's hearts of stone into human again. And that is where God is. And this is what Robin's talking about. And this is their test.
Yeah.
Is God in their heart, or is he just, you know, are they going to just go with whatever wind blows them which
Right.
way and change who they are?
Yeah, absolutely. And not only in later prophecies like Isaiah and Jeremiah, but we see this even as far back as, and possibly earlier, but as far back as Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, Moses, as he's preparing the people to go into the promised land, which he's not going to go with them. So this is, I always think of Deuteronomy as Moses' final fatherly words to his children to say, you're going on without me, here's what you need to remember. And in Deuteronomy 28, verse 15, and then you can see it in 36 through 37, 15 is the warning. If you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. And he lists a number of curses from 16 on, but notice in verse 36, he says, the Lord will bring you and your king, whom you set over you, to a nation that neither you nor your fathers have known, and there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, and you shall become a horror, a proverb, and a byword among all the peoples where the Lord will you away. That's what Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are facing. They're experiencing that firsthand. They have been taken captive. Why? Did they do something wrong? Go ahead, Mark.
I think we briefly touched on last week after class, and that to me is amazing. In the middle of this king who's just a terrible king, these guys have all of this faith. Something was going right somewhere in the kingdom. It's just not with the king.
Yeah, it's specifically the king being Jehoiakim that's referenced in verse 1, right? Jehoiakim, the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim of Judah, is a reference to, we see this in 2 Kings, we see this in the Chronicles, but a recognition that Jehoiakim was doing evil in the sight of the Lord. He just had totally given up on trying to serve God. And God realized there was no hope in restoring him. And so he is pulled from his kingship and taken captive, and then all of the people that go with him. So Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they are experiencing a punishment against the nation because they put a leader in who did not lead them towards God. And so now the test is, will you remain faithful? Okay? What else do you notice in this section? There's tons in here still. Yeah, Gary.
I wish I knew or remembered the exact place, but I'm pretty sure it's Isaiah, whereas God, through the prophet, says to the people, when you're captured and go into that land, keep living life. Have children. You're going to get married. It's kind of like New Testament. As much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. But never leave God or forget his statutes. And it's just kind of interesting to me that that's told to the people. The best thing you can do is go and be as happy as you can be and obey God.
Yeah, remain faithful.
Yeah.
So that in the trial and the dispersion and the exile, you'll still remain blessed and have the hope of being with God.
And then in Esther, God's with them, right?
Oh, yeah. We saw that in Esther, absolutely. And we're going to see it throughout this book. Those who seek after God will remain assured of a hope to come. All right, so here we have Jehoiakim being taken away because of his evil deeds. And here comes Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Now, if Nebuchadnezzar's a tongue tire for you, tongue twister, there are two other authorized versions that we can use. King Neb. Or what was the other one? Mr. Nezer. So if Nebuchadnezzar's too hard, I'll allow those two options. King Neb or Mr. Nezer. So you can refer to those as well. But Nebuchadnezzar comes in and takes captives. But what else does he take? Vessels. Vessels from where? The house of God. The holy vessels that were consecrated back at Mount Sinai. The holy vessels that were restored in the time of David. The holy vessels that became the identity of the people and a peace for the people. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, and that's part of what God gave into the hand of King Neb. is not just the people, but also the possessions from his house.
Yeah, which means the house is now consecrated. Or now...
Desecrated.
Desecrated, that's the word. It's now defiled. It no longer is designed to God's specifications. Meaning God no longer dwells there. And God is showing that and letting these and handing over these vessels to a foreign nation. Now we'll see in chapter 5, verse 2, the reference back to these vessels. Okay? We're going to see a reference to the gold and silver vessels being used. But what else do we see happens to these vessels, or what else do you notice? Lisa?
I think I had another hand.
Oh, he's over there with the microphone. We'll do that real quick and then get him over here.
Put him in the treasury of his God.
Yeah. So not only are they being taken away and defiling the dwelling place of God, but beyond that, they are receiving added desecration by going and being used in service to another god. Very much like the identity of Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They're trying to defile them in a similar way. Serve our gods. Be used for our gods. Go ahead, Ida.
I just thought the language was very interesting, and it continues this way. But he talks about how, you've got Jehoiakim, and then Nebuchadnezzar comes. And Jehoiakim doesn't have any part in this. God gives him to Mr. Nezer. And then from then on, the pronoun refers to Nebuchadnezzar. He did this. And so the whole focus is away from Judah, Israel, and everything, and on to this foreign king.
Yeah.
So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it's as if I think the narrative is forcing us to consider that God has given his people up to King Nebuchadnezzar to do with as he pleases. And so he does. Okay, what else do we notice here? Lisa?
This is the third year of Nebuchadnezzar, and then the young men are trained for 3 years.
Pattern of 3. So you say it might seem like a small thing, but you're seeing something more. What are you seeing there?
It's just interesting that in this amount of time, Nebuchadnezzar has put his rule in place. He's a mighty king. I always find it interesting that God actually, to me, God chose him, and I think we see that all through the whole pattern of Daniel where Nebuchadnezzar is concerned, is that God keeps showing to Nebuchadnezzar that he's the one that puts the kings in place.
Yeah.
So I always found it interesting that God chose Nebuchadnezzar to take Israel into captivity. with the knowledge of how they trained their young men, how they treated their captives, how, to me, God had that foreknowledge of knowing. And then they're giving them 3 years to learn the language and the literature.
Yeah.
Which is, being an English teacher, that's super interesting to me, that, you know, they had to learn how to read and know the language, read the language, and then everything that has to do with the culture is in the reading. So to me, that was super interesting that, you know, Nebuchadnezzar had the foresight in his 3 years of rule, and he gave these young men 3 years to learn, you know,
Yeah.
basically what he wanted them to know about the language and culture.
Yeah. I also see something else in the pattern of 3. Mark has something to add to that. I see a smirk.
This is about kings.
If we could get the mic real quick,
It's
just
about kings and authority and who is in authority. And then you have this 3-year discipleship that you see happen some 600 years later again. Only it's for that same authority that we end up with here,
yeah.
which is God.
And for me, my mind sees a pattern of 3 that 3 something. Sometimes in the Bible, he'll shift between 40 days, 40 years, but they're representing the same thing. So if we shift from years to days, right? 3 years, and you have to go before the king and be tested. 3 days to go before the king to be found worthy. Isn't that what Jesus does? This, I think, is one of those moments that Jesus refers to in his gospel. As he's proclaiming to them, there's a pattern of 3 here. It said after 3 days, I have to rise. Is this one of those? Possibly. An example of what it looks like after a testing of 3 years here or days, that the king will rise, or you'll go before the king. You'll go before God. Okay? What else do you notice? Any of the language about how he chooses these people sound familiar? Yes. Great. Good answer. Moving on. No. What sounds familiar? What specifically, Aaron? Thank you for pointing out my yes/no answer question there.
Without blemish
Without blemish.
is, a very common phrase. Of course, thinking about sacrifice and the instruction to the Israelites, good appearance. But if you think about, we're talking about assimilation. We're talking about how you bring another people in to your kingdom, and it is done through education and language.
Yeah.
And they start with the people of nobility and the royal family, and those that are also skillful and knowledgeable already, so they have aptitude to learn and also to contribute something. But they've already proven themselves to be people that can learn quickly and are competent. But that would be the way to kind of spread this new ideology through the people. We're talking about making disciples,
Yeah.
in a sense, because they would learn the language, they would learn the culture, and then they would be passing that information along to the rest of their Hebrew-speaking brothers and sisters.
Absolutely.
And so, how do we make disciples? I think there's a good lesson here in how we bring people in to the fold. We teach them the language of the Bible and the culture of the church and the family, and with the expectation that then they would go and share that with the people that they know.
Absolutely. Xander, if you'll make your way to Ida, I'll go with that. Aaron, is where you started the without blemish. That was the phrase used for the Passover lamb. That you would choose a lamb without blemish, and it would be the sacrificial lamb. that would show your faithfulness to God. That it was the cream of your crop, right? It was the best of yours. It was without blemish, and it was perfect. And here, now we have people working in that. God is using them, giving over the best of his people, allowing Nebuchadnezzar to take them and then try to make disciples of them, even to the point that he treats them well and gives them of his food, right? Dine at my table, basically. Come, be part of me. You're part of my family now. And so we see that same idea that we should do similarly. Ida?
It kind of reminds me of another guy.
Yeah?
Who was from a royal lineage, and he was spotless, and he was skillful even when he was a kid, and he went and he stood before the religious authorities, and it just reminds me of that other person.
And who would that be? Jesus, thank you. Jesus, yeah. I mean, this is an example, or seeing, if we're seeing that 3-day pattern and we're seeing the sacrificial lamb language, this is in some ways referencing and foreshadowing the Messiah to come. And we should see that picture here. And yet, as we see, you referenced verse 8. We won't have time to really talk about it, but they did not defile themselves. They chose not to defile themselves. That would have been hard. That would have been really hard to do. Not because it's just a matter of what to eat, but if you consider the idea of going into Babylon and facing that culture as captives, not knowing their language likely, not knowing their culture, not knowing what's going to happen to you, losing the identity of we were safe in the holy city of God, protected by God, now what is he doing to us? There's a lot that would have made them think, well, clearly God doesn't want us, so we'll give in. And yet they choose not to. Next week, we'll start there in verse 8, and really there's some things I want to show that really press on us how difficult it would have been walking into Babylon, walking down what they called the processional way, into the gate, and having the crowd around them as the captors were coming in. What would they have seen? What would they have experienced? And then to still maintain, I will not defile myself. It's a big choice. So be thinking about that. Would you be able to do the same thing? All right, any final thoughts? I think we are at time. Yeah, we are at time. So we'll wrap that up, and then if next week we'll pick up in verse 8 and move on from there. Wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for your input.